Diane Creel did not knock on my door. She did not call. She did not leave a note in the mailbox the way neighbors do when they have a problem they want to talk through like adults. She hired 2 men to pour concrete across my farm entrance at 6 in the morning. And then she walked to the edge of her property and stood there with her arms folded, watching them do it. I saw her from the kitchen window. I had May's lunch bag in one hand and my coffee in the other. I set both down on the counter and I walked outside. The concrete was already spreading. Wall to wall. Across both cedar posts my father installed the year I was born. The only vehicle entrance wide enough for the hay truck, the flatbed, the vet when an animal needed help and could not wait until morning. I stopped about 10 feet from the foreman. He was older, clipboard in hand, high-vis vest. He looked at me the way people look at you when they have already decided you are not going to be a problem. "Work order says unpermitted access point," he said. "Code violation. We are here to fill it." I looked at the clipboard. Then I looked at him. "Who filed the complaint?" I said. He glanced up the road. Just for a second. Then back to me. "That information's not on my order," he said. He did not have to tell me. I already knew. I had known the moment I saw her standing there. Diane Creel, 60 yards away, watching with the kind of stillness that belongs to someone who has been planning something for a long time and is finally watching it happen. I looked at her. She looked at me. She did not wave. She did not speak. She just stood there in her pressed khakis and her garden clogs, and she gave me the smallest smile I have ever seen on a human face. That smile told me everything. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a contractor at the wrong address. This was not a clerical error at the county office. This was a message. She had decided, at some point between being my neighbor and becoming my enemy, that she could take something from me. That I would not know how to stop her. That I was the kind of person things happened to. I stood there in the early morning, watching my entrance disappear under wet concrete, and I made a decision of my own. She was wrong about me. She just did not know it yet. I took a photo of the work order before the foreman pulled it back. Not the whole thing. Just enough. The contractor name, the filing date, and the code reference number printed along the bottom edge. The foreman saw me do it and said nothing. There was nothing he could say. I was standing on my own property. May came out of the front door at 6:52 with her backpack half-zipped and one shoe untied. She stopped on the porch steps and looked at the men and the mixer and the wet grey lines spreading across the entrance. "Dad," she said, "what are they doing to the driveway?" "Fixing something," I said. "Come here, let me get that shoe." She walked over and I crouched down and tied it. I kept my back to the workers while I did it. I did not want her to see my face right then. The bus came 4 minutes later. I watched it pull away, and then I stood in the yard for a long moment without moving. The foreman and his guy were packing up by then. The concrete was down. Still wet, still dark, but already taking the shape of something permanent. They loaded the mixer onto the trailer without looking at me. The foreman dropped a business card on the ground near the post, did not hand it to me, just dropped it, and they drove away. I picked up the card. Hendricks Property Solutions. A phone number. No address. I walked to the edge of the new concrete and looked at it. 31 years. My father built that entrance the year I was born. He set those cedar posts himself, tamped the gravel himself, and told me once that a man's entrance to his land was the first thing people saw and the last thing they should ever be able to take. He had been dead for 4 years. He was not here to see this. I think about that sometimes, what he would have done standing where I was standing that morning. He was not a loud man either. He did not argue in circles or make threats he could not back up. He would have looked at that concrete for about 30 seconds, gone inside, and started making calls. So that is what I did. The first call was to the county assessor's office. I had the parcel number memorized. I had been managing this property alone for 4 years, and you learn the numbers fast when you are the only one responsible for them. The woman who answered was polite. She pulled up the record. She told me there was a complaint filed 8 days ago citing an unpermitted vehicular access point on my parcel. Filed by an adjacent property owner. "Can you tell me which adjacent owner?" I said. A pause. "I can tell you the complaint came from the north boundary," she said carefully. Diane Creel's property sat directly to my north. I thanked the woman and ended the call. I sat at the kitchen table with my notepad and wrote down everything I knew so far. The date. The time. the contractor name, the code number, the filing date, the direction of the complaint. Then I wrote one more line at the bottom of the page. She did this because she thinks I will not know what to do next. I underlined it once. Then I got to work. I have owned this land for 4 years. Before that, my father owned it for 31. Before him, his father worked it as a tenant before buying the deed outright in 1962, paying cash, because banks in that county did not lend easily to men who looked like my grandfather. 3 generations, 60+ years. 114 acres of mixed pasture and timber with a creek running along the south edge that my daughter thinks belongs to her personally. I did not grow up planning to be a farmer. I spent 8 years working logistics for a freight company in the city, scheduling, routing, contracts, compliance. It is not glamorous work, but it teaches you how systems operate and, more importantly, how they fail. When my father's health declined, I came back to help him manage the property. When he died, I stayed because May was 5 years old and I was not going to raise her in an apartment 2 hours from the only land our family had ever owned outright. My wife had left 2 years before that. I am not going to spend much time on that part of the story because it is not what this is about. What matters is that when my father died, I was alone on 114 acres with a 5-year-old, a herd of cattle that needed daily attention, equipment that was older than I was, and a mortgage that did not care about any of that. I figured it out. Slowly, and not always gracefully, but I figured it out. By the time Diane Creel became my problem, I had been running this operation solo for 4 years. The cattle herd was stable. I had a hay contract with 2 local ranches. I had rebuilt the south fence line myself over the course of 1 summer. I was not thriving in the way that looks good from the outside. But I was standing. And the land was intact. That entrance, the one now buried under Diane Creel's concrete, was not just a driveway. It was the only point of vehicle access on the north side of the property. The county road ran along that edge. Every delivery came through those cedar posts. Every piece of equipment I moved on and off the property went through there. The south boundary had a gate, but it opened onto a private easement road shared with 2 other landowners and was not reliable for large vehicles. Lose the north entrance and I lose the ability to run this operation. Simple as that. Diane Creel either knew that, or she had been advised of it. Either way, she had not picked that entrance by accident. She had been my neighbor for 3 years. For the first year she was merely unfriendly, the kind of neighbor who does not wave back, who watches your vehicles from her porch, who calls the county about your fence line being 6 inches over the boundary, and then disputes the surveyor's findings when they prove her wrong. I had let all of it go. I had work to do and a daughter to raise, and I did not have energy left over for a neighbor who needed to feel powerful by making other people feel small. That was my first mistake. The second year Diane Creel owned the property next to mine, she got a dog. A large one. Some kind of shepherd mix with a bark that carried across the pasture at any hour it felt necessary. That was fine. Dogs bark. I was not going to file a noise complaint over a dog. What was not fine was that she let it run the fence line unsupervised every morning. My cattle are not easily spooked. They are used to noise, used to the property, used to the rhythms of the place. But a dog running the fence at speed, barking hard, will stress a herd. Stressed cattle lose weight. Lost weight is lost money when you are running a small operation on tight margins. I walked over one morning in October and knocked on her door. She answered in a robe, coffee in hand, and looked at me the way people look at a salesman they did not invite. "Your dog is running my fence line every morning," I said. "It is stressing the herd. I would appreciate it if you kept him in until after 7. She looked at me for a long moment. "My dog has as much right to be outside as your cows," she said. Then she closed the door. I stood on her porch for a second, then turned and walked back across the road. I called the county extension office that afternoon and asked whether there was a formal process for livestock stress complaints related to neighboring animals. There was, but it required documented weight loss over a 30-day period with veterinary verification. I did not have time for that, and honestly, I did not want to spend the money. So I built a secondary buffer fence along the north pasture edge instead. Took me 4 days and about $600 in materials. It worked. The dog still ran and barked, but the cattle stopped reacting. I absorbed the cost. I solved the problem myself. I moved on. I realize now that this is what she was watching. Every time I absorbed something and moved on, she saw it as evidence that she could push further. Not because she was strategic in a sophisticated way. I do not think Diane Creel was playing a long game with any real precision. I think she was simply the kind of person who tests boundaries the way water tests a wall. Constantly, quietly, in small amounts, until she found the crack. The fence complaint came 6 months after the dog incident. She filed with the county claiming my north boundary fence encroached 14 inches onto her property. The county sent a surveyor. The surveyor measured. The fence was on my side by a margin of 8 inches. She disputed the findings. Filed a second complaint. The county sent the same surveyor. Same result. I still have both survey reports in a folder in my filing cabinet. I did not throw them away because somewhere in the back of my mind I already understood that this was not over. People like Diane Creel do not stop because they are wrong. They stop because continuing becomes more costly than walking away. I had not yet figured out how to make it costly, but I was starting to think about it. The concrete went down on a Tuesday. By Thursday I had made 11 phone calls, driven to the county offices twice, and spent one evening at the kitchen table with every property document I owned spread out in front of me while May did her homework 3 feet away and pretended not to notice that something was wrong. She was 9. She noticed everything. "Dad," she said at one point, without looking up from her worksheet, "is someone trying to take our farm?" I looked at her for a second. "No," I said. "Someone is trying to make things difficult. There is a difference." She thought about that. "What is the difference?" she said. "Difficult I can work with," I said. "Take is a lot harder than people think." She seemed to accept that and went back to her worksheet. I went back to my documents. Here is what I had learned in those first 48 hours. The code complaint Diane filed cited a county ordinance requiring permits for vehicular access points on rural parcels connecting to county roads. The ordinance was real. The requirement was real. What was also real was that my entrance predated the ordinance by nearly 2 decades. My father had built it in 1987. The ordinance was adopted in 2004, and there was a grandfather clause written directly into the code that exempted pre-existing access points from the permit requirement provided they were in documented continuous use. Continuous use. That was the phrase I kept coming back to. My entrance had been in continuous use since 1987. I had delivery receipts, vet records, equipment rental agreements, years of paperwork that placed vehicles coming and going through those cedar posts on a regular basis. The use was not in question. The documentation existed. What I did not yet understand was why the county had acted on the complaint without reviewing that history first. Ordinarily, a grandfather clause review was part of the process. Someone had either skipped that step or had not looked closely enough. The second thing I learned was more interesting. When I pulled the full parcel history at the assessor's office, I found something I had not known before, a road designation. Faint, old, listed in the parcel notes as inactive. But there. A cattle route designation running along the north boundary of my property, recorded in 1938, that predated every fence, every ordinance, every property transfer in the chain. The designation had never been formally vacated. I wrote the words down carefully in my notepad. 1938 cattle route. North boundary. Never vacated. I did not fully understand what that meant yet. I did not know if it meant anything useful at all. But something in my chest shifted slightly when I read it, the way it shifts when you are looking for a door in a dark room and your hand finds a handle. I closed the folder and sat back in my chair. May had fallen asleep at the table, her pencil still in her hand. I carried her to bed, and then came back and sat alone in the kitchen for a long time, thinking. The county code enforcement office was on the second floor of a building that smelled like old carpet and printer toner. I had been there twice in 4 years, once to pull a permit for a structure repair, once to contest a drainage assessment. I knew where the elevator was, and I knew which window handled rural parcel complaints. The woman at the window was named Carol. I knew that because her nameplate said Carol, and because she had helped me with the drainage assessment 2 years prior, and had been straightforward with me then. I slid the code complaint number across the counter. "I need to understand the review process on this one," I said. "Specifically whether a grandfather clause evaluation was completed before the work order was issued." Carol typed the number in. Read the screen. Typed something else. She was quiet for longer than felt routine. "Mr. Hart," she said, keeping her voice level. "The work order on this complaint was processed on an expedited basis. I looked at her. Expedited, I said. What does that mean on a rural access complaint? It means it was flagged for accelerated review and the standard documentation check was condensed. Condensed, I said. Meaning the grandfather clause review was skipped. She did not answer that directly. She looked at her screen. I would recommend submitting a formal appeal, she said, with supporting documentation of continuous prior use. If the grandfather clause applies, the work order should not have been issued. Carol, I said, who flags a complaint for expedited processing? She looked at me carefully. That determination is made internally, she said. I thanked her and walked back to the elevator. I sat in my truck in the parking lot for 10 minutes and thought about what expedited processing meant in practical terms. It meant someone had moved this complaint to the front of the line. It meant the standard review steps had been bypassed. It meant that either someone inside the office had taken an unusual interest in Diane Creel's complaint, or Diane Creel had found a way to make her complaint appear more urgent than it was. Either way, my entrance had been buried under concrete because someone had pushed a button that should not have been pushed without completing the required review. I drove home, fed the cattle, fixed a section of water line that had been giving me trouble for a week, picked May up from school, made dinner, got her to bed. Then I sat down and wrote a 4-page formal appeal to the County Code Enforcement Office citing the grandfather clause, attaching 12 documents establishing continuous use going back to 1989, and requesting a full audit of the expedited processing decision. I signed it, dated it, made 3 copies, and put it in an envelope. Then I opened my notepad to the page where I had written the cattle route designation. 1938 cattle route, north boundary. Never vacated. I had spent 2 evenings reading county road law. What I had found was this. A designated cattle route recorded in the county register was considered a public right-of-way until formally vacated through a specific legal process, a process that required public notice, a county commissioner vote, and a 30-day objection period. None of that had ever happened with this route, which meant, on paper, it was still open. I want to be honest about something. There were days in that first week where I was not quiet and controlled. There were mornings where I stood at the kitchen window with my coffee and looked at that concrete slab sitting across my entrance and felt something close to despair. Not the dramatic kind. The quiet kind. The kind that sits in your stomach when you are already tired and someone adds one more thing to the weight you are carrying. I was running a cattle operation alone. I was raising a 9-year-old alone. I was managing 114 acres of land alone. And now I was also building a legal case alone against a neighbor who had somehow managed to get a county work order processed in 8 days while bypassing the standard review steps. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from being a single parent in a situation like that. It is not just physical. It is the exhaustion of knowing that if you stop, everything stops. May's stability, the operation, the land, all of it was balanced on me continuing to function. I did not have the option of falling apart. So I did not fall apart. But I will not pretend the weight was not there. What kept me moving was something simple. My father had bought this land to keep it. My grandfather had worked this land before he owned it, because owning it was not an option available to him at the time. When he finally did buy the deed, he paid cash, and he kept every document in a fireproof box that I still had in the back of my closet. Inside that box was the original 1962 deed, the survey from that year, a letter from the county confirming the transfer, and a handwritten note in my grandfather's careful print that said simply, "This is ours now. Keep it that way." I had read that note approximately 400 times in my life. I read it again that week. Then I mailed the appeal, called a land use attorney named Patricia So for a 30-minute consultation that cost me $150 I did not have to spare, and asked her one specific question. If a cattle route was recorded in the county register in 1938, and never formally vacated, does it constitute a legal right-of-way? She was quiet for a moment. Generally, yes, she said. An unvacated recorded route retains its designation until properly closed through the statutory process. Where is this route located? Along my north boundary, I said, directly adjacent to the access point that was just filled with concrete. Another pause, longer this time. Mr. Hart, she said, I think you should pull the original 1938 registration document from the county recorder's office. The full document, not just the parcel note reference. What am I looking for? I said. The route width, she said. and the recorded terminus points. I wrote both of those down. One more question, I said. If the route runs where I think it runs, what would reopening it require? Considerably less, she said, than your neighbor thinks. The county recorder's office kept documents older than 1970 in a separate archive room on the ground floor. Not digital. Physical. Bound ledgers and file folders in metal shelving units that ran floor to ceiling along 3 walls. The archivist was a man named Gerald who had worked there for 22 years and knew the filing system the way some people know scripture. I told him I was looking for a route registration from 1938, north boundary of parcel 114R, and he disappeared into the shelving without a word and came back 4 minutes later with a bound ledger the size of a large dictionary. He set it on the reading table and opened it to a page marked with a yellow sticky note he had placed there himself during his walk back. Route designations 1935 to 1941, he said. Your parcel reference should be in the middle third. I sat down and started reading. I found it on the 7th page. Route designation 1938 CR 114. Recorded April 14, 1938. North boundary access corridor, parcel 114 and adjacent parcels, width 16 feet, running east to west along the county road frontage, designated for livestock passage and agricultural vehicle use. Terminus points. East at the county road junction marker, west at the creek boundary. I read it 3 times. 16 feet wide, running east to west along the exact line where my cedar post entrance had stood for 31 years. Terminus at the county road, which was exactly where the concrete now sat. The route had not been placed near my entrance. My entrance had been built on top of the route. My father had set those cedar posts directly within the boundaries of a recorded public right-of-way, probably because he knew it was there, and understood that building within an existing designation was cleaner than applying for a new access permit. He had never mentioned this to me directly. But my father was not a man who explained his decisions in detail. He made them carefully, and he left the evidence behind for whoever came next to find. I asked Gerald for a certified copy of the page. He charged me $8 and produced it in 11 minutes. I sat in my truck in the recorder's office parking lot and looked at that certified copy for a long time. Diane Creel had poured concrete across a 16-foot public right-of-way that had been on the county books since 1938. She had done it by filing a code complaint about an unpermitted access point, but the access point was not unpermitted. It was built within a route that predated every permit requirement in the county by 66 years. She had not checked. Or she had checked and not understood what she was reading. Or she had understood and assumed I would not find it. Any of those 3 possibilities told me the same thing. She had made a significant error. I started the truck and pulled out of the parking lot. I had a delivery to coordinate, a fence section to check, and May needed to be picked up at 3:15. I would think through the next steps that evening. But for the first time since Tuesday morning, the weight in my stomach had shifted into something else entirely. Patricia So called me back the same evening. I pulled the certified copy. I had sent her a scan of the document from my phone, 3 sentences of context, and a question. What does this mean for the concrete? She did not waste time on preamble. The route designation changes everything, she said. A recorded public right-of-way cannot be obstructed by a private party. Full stop. It does not matter whether your access point had a permit or not. The underlying corridor is a county-designated route, and blocking it is not a code enforcement matter, it is an obstruction of a public right-of-way. Meaning the concrete should not have been poured, I said. Meaning the concrete should not have been poured, the work order that authorized it was issued in error. And the party who filed the complaint that generated that work order may have civil exposure for the cost of obstruction and removal. I wrote that down. Civil exposure, I said. Meaning I can go after her for damages. Potentially, yes. Obstruction of a recorded right-of-way, filing a complaint that you could argue she knew or should have known, was based on incomplete information, costs associated with the disruption to your operation. It is not a guaranteed outcome, but it is a legitimate legal position. What do I do first? I said. File the right-of-way obstruction notice with the county road department, she said. Not code enforcement road department. They handle right-of-way maintenance and obstruction. When they see a 1938 designation with a current obstruction sitting on top of it, they are going to have to respond. That is their statutory obligation. How long does that take? I said. Depends on the county. Could be 2 weeks, Could be 6. And in the meantime, my entrance stays buried, I said. In the meantime, your entrance stays buried, she said. But here is the thing, Mr. Hart. You are no longer fighting a code complaint. You are sitting on a recorded right-of-way with documented obstruction, and a paper trail showing the obstruction was caused by a neighbor's complaint that bypassed standard review. That is a very different position than where you were 4 days ago. I thanked her and ended the call. I sat with that for a few minutes. Then I opened my laptop and pulled up the County Road Department's website. The obstruction complaint form was listed under a tab called Right-of-Way Maintenance. I downloaded it, filled it out, attached the certified copy of the 1938 designation, attached my appeal from code enforcement, attached the 12 continuous use documents, and wrote a cover letter that was 2 paragraphs long and contained no emotional language whatsoever. Facts only. Dates, document numbers, statutory references Patricia had given me. I printed everything, assembled it into a packet, and put it in a fresh envelope. Then I sat back and thought about Diane Creel. She had filed her complaint 8 days before the concrete was poured. She had gotten it expedited. She had stood at her property line and watched my entrance disappear and smiled at me. She believed she had won. She had not checked the 1938 ledger. She had not pulled the full parcel history. She had found one ordinance, one code reference, and she had used it like a hammer without looking at what was underneath. That was her error. And unlike the fence complaint and the dog and the buffer I had built at my own expense, this one I was not going to absorb quietly. I filed the right-of-way obstruction notice on a Friday morning. I drove it to the County Road Department office in person, rather than mailing it. I wanted a date stamp on my copy from a human being, not a postmark that could get lost in processing. The clerk at the front desk, a younger man, maybe mid-20s, looked at the packet thickness and raised an eyebrow. Rural right-of-way obstruction, I said. 1938 designation. I have a certified copy of the registration inside. He took the packet and stamped it and handed me my copy without a word. I drove home. The following Tuesday, I got a call from a man named Dale Whitmore, who identified himself as a senior field inspector with the County Road Department. His voice was flat and professional, and he got to the point quickly. Mr. Hart, I have reviewed your obstruction filing. I need to do a site visit to confirm the location and extent of the obstruction relative to the recorded route boundaries. Would Thursday morning work for you? Thursday works, I said. I will need access to your north boundary line, he said. You will have it, I said. He arrived Thursday at 8:15 in a white county truck. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s with a measuring wheel and a tablet, and the unhurried manner of someone who had been doing this work long enough to have seen most things. I met him at the road and walked him to the entrance. He stood in front of the concrete and looked at it for a moment without speaking. Then he took out his tablet and pulled up what I assumed was the route designation record. He looked at the screen, then at the concrete, then at the cedar posts on either side. He took 4 measurements with the wheel, wrote them on his tablet, walked the full width of the designated corridor east and west from the obstruction point, measuring as he went. I stood back and let him work. After about 20 minutes he came back to where I was standing. The obstruction sits directly within the recorded corridor, he said. Center placement extends the full width of the designated route. Yes, I said. He made a note on his tablet. Mr. Hart, I am going to be straightforward with you. A private party obstructing a recorded county right-of-way is not a grey area. My office is going to have to issue a formal obstruction notice to the responsible party and require removal at their expense. I looked at him. The responsible party being the neighbor who filed the original complaint, I said. The responsible party being whoever caused the obstruction, he said carefully. That determination will be part of the formal process. And the contractor who poured it, I said. Both parties may receive notice depending on what the documentation shows, he said. He closed his tablet. I will have my report filed by end of week, he said. You should receive a copy as the affected right-of-way holder. He shook my hand and walked back to his truck. I stood at the edge of the concrete and looked at it. Diane Creel's house was visible from where I stood if I looked north. Her car was in the driveway. Her curtains were drawn. I wondered if she had watched the white county truck pull up. I wondered if she had recognized what it meant. Probably not yet. She would. Dale Whitmore's report landed in my mailbox on a Monday, 9 days after his site visit. It was 6 pages. County letterhead. dense with technical language and statutory references. I read it twice at the kitchen table before May woke up, then once more slowly with a notepad beside me. The key findings were on page 3. The obstruction was confirmed as sitting within the boundaries of route designation 1938 CR 114. The concrete placement covered the full 16-foot corridor width. The obstruction had been caused by a contracted work order issued by county code enforcement. The work order had been generated by a complaint filed by the adjacent north property owner. The complaint had been processed without a right-of-way review, which was listed in the report as a procedural error on the part of the Code Enforcement Office. That last line mattered. It meant the county was acknowledging internally that their own process had failed. Page 4 contained the formal obstruction notice issued to Diane Creel as the filing party of the original complaint. She was identified as the responsible initiating party. The notice required her to coordinate removal of the obstruction within 45 days at her expense or face county-initiated removal with full cost recovery. I set the report down and drank my coffee. 45 days. A contractor. Her expense. I thought about what that would cost her. Breaking up a full-width concrete pour across a 16-foot corridor, hauling the debris, resurfacing the ground. Somewhere between $4,000 and $8,000 depending on who she hired. Maybe more. May came downstairs at 7, poured herself cereal, and looked at me across the kitchen. "You look different," she said. "Different how?" I said. She thought about it. "Less like something is sitting on you," she said. I looked at her for a second. "Go get your backpack," I said. After I put her on the bus, I called Patricia So and read her the key sections of the report. "Good," she said when I finished. "This is the foundation. Now I want you to do something before the 45-day clock runs out." "What?" I said. "Document your operational losses from the day the concrete was poured to the day the entrance is restored. Every delivery rerouted, every additional cost incurred, every hour of your time spent managing the obstruction. Receipts where you have them, written logs where you do not." "I have been keeping a log," I said. "Of course you have," she said. "Good. Keep it going. If she does not comply with the removal notice within 45 days, we have a stronger damages position. If she does comply, we still have the documented losses from the obstruction period." "And the expedited process in question," I said. "Someone flagged that complaint to move it faster than normal. That step still bothers me." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "It should bother you," she said. "Do you have any reason to believe Diane Creel had a connection inside the Code Enforcement Office?" I thought about it. "I do not know yet," I said. "Find out," she said. Finding out meant asking questions in a small county where people talked. I am not naturally a social person. I do my work, I raise my daughter, I keep my head down. But I had lived in this county my entire life except for the 8 years I spent in the city, and my father had lived here his whole life before me, and my grandfather before him. 60 years of the heart name in one place leaves a certain amount of goodwill in certain places if you have not done anything to spend it down. I started with my hay contractor, a man named Russell Briggs who had farmed the county for 40 years and knew everyone who had ever filed anything with anyone. I mentioned over the phone, casually, that I had run into an interesting situation with a code enforcement complaint that had been expedited unusually fast. Russell was quiet for a second. "Expedited by who?" he said. "That is what I am trying to understand," I said. "What is the neighbor's name?" he said. I told him. Another pause. Longer. "Diane Creel," he said slowly. "She moved in out there about 3 years ago, came from Hargrove County. Her brother-in-law is Dennis Fielding." I did not recognize the name. "Dennis Fielding," I said. "Sits on the County Planning and Zoning Advisory Board," Russell said. "Has for about 6 years. He and the head of code enforcement play golf together every other Saturday at Millbrook." I wrote the name down. "Russell," I said. "That is useful." "I figured it might be," he said. "You doing all right out there, Caleb?" "Working on it," I said. I ended the call and sat with Dennis Fielding's name for a while. An advisory board member with a personal relationship with the head of code enforcement. A complaint that was expedited without standard review. A work order issued in 8 days on a rural access point that should have triggered a grandfather clause evaluation. None of that was proof of anything. An advisory board member calling in a favor for a family member was not necessarily illegal. It was the kind of thing that happened in small counties and rarely surfaced because the person on the receiving end usually did not know to look for it. I knew to look for it now. I pulled up the County Planning and Zoning Board's public meeting minutes on the county website. They were posted quarterly. I went back 18 months and read through every set. Dennis Fielding's name appeared regularly. He voted on variances, access permits, rural development applications. On the meeting minutes from 7 months ago, he had recused himself from a vote on an access permit application for a rural parcel in the North District. The parcel number listed in the recusal note was not mine, but it was in my district, and the recusal meant he had acknowledged a conflict of interest on at least one access-related matter in the recent past. I printed that page. Then I printed the full 12 months of meeting minutes and put them in a folder behind the Whitmore report. I was not going to use any of this yet. I was going to let the 45-day clock run, but I wanted everything in order when the time came. The 45-day clock ran out on a Thursday. No contractor showed up. No removal equipment. No communication from Diane Creel. Not a letter. Not a phone call. Not a note in the mailbox. The concrete sat exactly where it had been since the Tuesday morning she had it poured. Undisturbed. Solid. I had expected this. People like Diane Creel do not respond to notices the way people who respect process respond to notices. They ignore them and wait to see what happens next. They have spent enough time watching other people back down that they apply the same expectation to every situation. The notice arrives, they feel a moment of alarm, and then they decide that nothing real is going to happen and go back to whatever they were doing. I called Dale Whitmore at the road department the morning after the deadline passed. The obstruction has not been removed, I said. I will note that in the file, he said. The next step is county-initiated removal. That process takes approximately 2 to 3 weeks to schedule once I flag the non-compliance. 2 to 3 weeks, I said. Correct. I will move it forward today. I thanked him and ended the call. Then I called Patricia So. The deadline passed, I said. No removal. Road department is initiating county removal with cost recovery. Good, she said. Now we move on the damages claim. I'm going to send you a letter of demand to review. It will go to Diane Creel directly and to Hendricks Property Solutions as the contracting party. I want both of them on notice before the county removes the concrete. How much are we claiming? I said. Operational losses based on your log, cost of alternative access arrangements, my consultation fees, and a figure for the obstruction period itself. I am putting it at 14,000 and change. We may not recover all of it, but the number needs to reflect the actual impact. $14,000. To Diane Creel, that was probably an inconvenience. To me, it was 3 months of operating margin. Send it, I said. The demand letter went out that Friday by certified mail. I kept a copy in the folder with everything else. That same evening, I made one more decision. I drove to the county recorder's office the following morning, a Friday, and filed a formal application to reopen route designation 1938 CR 114 for active use. The application cited the unvacated status of the designation, the current obstruction, and my rights as the adjacent property owner to utilize the recorded corridor once the obstruction was removed. The clerk processed it in 20 minutes. I walked out with a stamped copy. The cattle route my grandfather's neighbors had used to move livestock along the north boundary of this land in 1938 was now formally applied for reactivation. Once the concrete came out, I had the legal standing to use every inch of that 16-foot corridor. Not just my old entrance width, the full 16 feet. I drove home in the early afternoon light and pulled up to the concrete slab and looked at it one more time. It had been 53 days since Diane Creel stood at her property line and smiled at me. The smile made sense to her then. It was starting to make less sense now. The demand letter landed in Diane Creel's mailbox on a Saturday. I know this because I was outside doing fence work when the mail carrier came through, and I watched the truck stop at her box and then continue up the road. I did not watch her house after that. I had work to do, and I did not need to see her reaction to know what it probably was. Russell Briggs called me Sunday evening. Heard something interesting at the co-op this morning, he said. What is that? I said. Diane Creel was in there buying garden supplies. Apparently she was telling anyone who would listen that her neighbor was harassing her with false legal claims and trying to steal access to her property. I was quiet for a second. Harassing her, I said. That is what she said. Also said she had friends at the county who would make sure nothing came of it. Friends at the county. Dennis Fielding. She was still counting on that connection to protect her. How many people were listening? I said. 4 or 5, Russell said, including Pete Granger, who owns the parcel on the east side of your property, and Linda Marsh, who does the county newsletter. I processed that. Russell, I said. Did anyone push back on what she was saying? Pete did, he said. Pete said he knew your family going back to your grandfather, and that if Caleb Hart filed a legal claim it was because he had a legal basis for it. She did not appreciate that. I thanked Russell and sat with that conversation for a while. Diane Creel was now talking publicly. She was framing herself as the victim. She was invoking her county connections openly enough that it was reaching the co-op on a Sunday morning. That told me she was feeling the pressure of the demand letter and the removal notice, and she was reaching for whatever she had left. What she had left was a brother-in-law on an advisory board and a story she was telling loudly to anyone nearby. Neither of those things was going to stop what was already in motion. The county removal crew showed up Wednesday morning. 2 trucks, a jackhammer unit, and 3 workers. They broke up the concrete in 4 hours. Loaded the debris, graded the surface back to rough level. Dale Whitmore was there for the first hour to supervise. Before he left, he handed me a copy of the county cost recovery notice that would be sent to Diane Creel and Hendricks Property Solutions jointly. The total was $6,400. I stood at my entrance, open again, cedar posts still standing on either side, and I looked down the access road toward the pasture. The cattle were visible at the far end, moving slow in the afternoon light. May was going to be home in 40 minutes. I had a delivery scheduled for Friday that I had been routing around the south easement for 7 weeks at extra cost and extra time. Friday it would come through the north entrance the way it always had. I went inside and called the delivery company to update the routing. 3 things happened in the 2 weeks after the concrete came out. The first was that Dennis Fielding quietly recused himself from 2 upcoming agenda items on the Planning and Zoning Board's quarterly meeting schedule. The recusal notices were posted in the public minutes the way they always were: dry, administrative, no explanation beyond the standard conflict of interest language. But both items related to rural access permits in the North District. His district. The district that contained my parcel and Diane Creel's. I printed those minutes and added them to the folder. I had not contacted Dennis Fielding directly. I had not needed to. Patricia's demand letter had named the expedited processing as a contributing factor in the obstruction claim, and it had cited the procedural error acknowledged in Whitmore's report. Anyone reading that letter carefully would understand that the question of how the complaint got expedited was part of the legal record. Fielding had apparently read it carefully enough. The second thing was that Linda Marsh called me. Linda ran the county newsletter, a small publication that covered local government, agricultural news, and community announcements. It went out monthly to about 2,000 subscribers in the county, mostly landowners and farmers, and people who paid attention to what the county commission was doing. She had heard about the situation from the co-op conversation Russell had mentioned. She had then apparently done some reading on her own. The right-of-way obstruction filing was public record. Whitmore's report was public record. The cost recovery notice was public record. "Mr. Hart," she said, "I would like to write a short piece on the right-of-way situation. Not about you specifically, more about the procedural question of how a code complaint gets expedited without a standard review, and what that means for rural landowners who may not know their rights under recorded route designations." I thought about it. "I am not interested in a story about me and my neighbor," I said. "That is not what I am writing," she said. "I am writing about a process failure at the Code Enforcement Office and what rural landowners should know about checking their parcel histories for recorded route designations. Your situation is the example. You do not have to be quoted by name." "Write it accurately," I said. "Everything you cite should be from the public record." "That is all I use," she said. The piece ran in the following month's newsletter. It was 14 paragraphs. It described the procedural failure factually, explained the 1938 route designation and the grandfather clause that had been bypassed, and included a sidebar on how rural landowners could search the county recorder's archive for historical route designations on their parcels. It did not name me. It did not name Diane Creel. It named Dennis Fielding once, in the context of his advisory board role and his pattern of recusals on North District access matters. The third thing that happened was that Diane Creel received Patricia's formal damages claim response from her homeowner's insurance carrier. Her carrier denied coverage. Obstruction of a public right-of-way did not qualify as an insurable incident under her policy terms. The denial letter, which Patricia obtained through the discovery process, used the phrase willful interference with a recorded public easement. Willful. Her own insurance company had used that word. She was now personally liable for $14,000 in claimed damages, plus the $6,400 from the county cost recovery. Over $20,000, with no insurance backstop. I did not celebrate when Patricia told me. I wrote the number down in my notepad and closed it. Patricia settled the damages claim 4 weeks later. Not in court. Diane Creel's personal attorney, a man from Hargrove County who had probably handled her real estate closing and not much else, contacted Patricia 2 days after the insurance denial and indicated his client wanted to resolve the matter without litigation. Patricia called me the same afternoon. She wants to settle, she said. Her attorney is proposing $11,000. I think we can get 13. What is your read on her position? I said. Weak, Patricia said. The insurance denial hurt her. The newsletter piece hurt her. The fielding recusals hurt her, because they signal that her internal connection has gone quiet. She has no remaining leverage and her attorney knows it. Get 13, I said. Patricia got 13 2 days later, certified funds, deposited into my account on a Thursday morning while I was fixing the water line that had finally given out completely along the east pasture. I finished the repair, washed my hands at the outdoor tap, and stood in the pasture for a few minutes. $13,000. It did not fully cover what the 7 weeks of obstruction had actually cost me in rerouting, delays, and lost operational efficiency. Patricia's fees came out of it too. What remained was real money, but it was not a windfall. It was partial restoration of something that should never have been taken in the first place. I was not going to pretend it felt like victory. It felt like getting back something that was already mine. What felt different, and I thought about this carefully because I wanted to be honest with myself about it, was something quieter than victory. It was the specific feeling of having been underestimated and having proven, without theatrics, that the underestimation was wrong. Diane Creel had looked at me and seen a single father running a marginal operation on inherited land. She had seen someone tired, stretched thin, without the resources or the knowledge to fight back effectively. She had seen someone things could be done to. She had been wrong about every part of that assessment, not because I was exceptional, because I had paid attention, kept records, asked the right questions, and refused to absorb one more thing quietly when absorbing it would cost me the land my grandfather had paid cash for in 1962. The route reactivation application was approved the same week as the settlement. Route designation 1938 CR 114 was formally listed as active in the county road register. The full 16-foot corridor along my north boundary was now on the books as an open agricultural right-of-way. I had the entrance re-gravelled at the correct width, 16 feet instead of the 12 my father had originally built to. 4 additional feet that changed nothing practically but represented something I could not fully articulate, except to say it felt correct. Russell Briggs came by the following Saturday to look at it. He stood between the cedar posts and looked down the access road and then back at me. Your dad would have liked those extra 4 feet, he said. I did not say anything for a moment. Yeah, I said. He would have. The for sale sign went up in Diane Creel's yard on a Friday morning in early spring. I saw it from the kitchen window, same window where I had stood 4 months earlier watching 2 men pour concrete across my entrance. I was in the same spot, same coffee mug, same work boots already on. May was eating breakfast behind me. I looked at the sign for about 10 seconds. Then I turned back to the kitchen. Bus in 12 minutes, I said. May looked up from her cereal. Is that the neighbour's house? She said. Yes, I said. She looked out the window, then back at me. Is she leaving because of what happened? She said. I thought about how to answer that honestly without loading it with more weight than it needed to carry. I think she realized this was not the right place for her, I said. May considered that with the particular seriousness she applied to things she suspected were more complicated than the explanation she had been given. Did you win? She said. I looked at her. I kept what was ours, I said. That is what winning looks like most of the time. She thought about that for a moment, then picked up her bowl and carried it to the sink. She was 9 years old, and she rinsed her own dishes without being asked. I noticed that every time she did it and never said anything about it. "Okay," she said, "I am getting my backpack." I watched her go upstairs. The real estate listing went live that same afternoon. I did not look it up. I did not need to know the asking price or the listing details or anything about Diane Creel's plans after she left. That was not my business, and it was not relevant to anything I needed to do. What I knew was this: she had filed a complaint designed to bury my entrance and strand my operation. She had used a county connection to expedite it past the standard review that would have caught the error immediately. She had stood at her property line and watched the concrete go down and smiled at me because she believed I did not have the knowledge or the resources or the will to fight back. And then she had spent 4 months watching every single assumption unravel. The code complaint reversed. The right-of-way confirmed. The obstruction removed at her expense. The insurance denial. The settlement. The newsletter piece. The fielding recusals. One by one, every piece of leverage she thought she had turned out to be made of the same material as the concrete she had poured. Temporary. Removable. Gone. I do not know what that experience felt like from her side. I do not spend time thinking about it. What I know is that by the time that for sale sign went into the ground, she had paid over $19,000 in combined costs and settlements, lost whatever goodwill she had with her county connection, and had her name attached, without being named, to a newsletter piece that every rural landowner in the county had read. Staying would have meant living next to that every day. Leaving made sense. The house sold in 6 weeks. I did not know the buyers. A couple from out of state, someone at the co-op mentioned, looking to get out of the city and into something quieter. I hoped they were the kind of people who waved back. I hoped they understood that quiet out here did not mean uncomplicated. It meant that the complications ran deeper and required more patience than most people were accustomed to bringing. I did not introduce myself the day they moved in. I gave them 2 weeks to settle. Then I walked over with a jar of honey from the 2 hives I keep along the south tree line and knocked on the door. A man answered. Mid-40s, looked like someone who had recently decided to stop being tired in a city and was still figuring out what came next. He looked at the honey jar and then at me. "Caleb Hart," I said. "I farm the property to the south. Wanted to introduce myself." He shook my hand. His name was Tom. His wife came to the door a moment later. They were friendly in the slightly cautious way of people who did not yet know what the social codes were in a new place. I did not mention Diane Creel. I did not mention the concrete or the right-of-way or any of it. That was not their story, and they did not need to inherit it. I told them the creek along my south boundary flooded in a heavy spring rain, and they should know that before they planned anything near the low ground on their north side. I told them the co-op on Route 9 was better than it looked from the road. I told them if they ever had a question about the property lines, I was happy to walk them. Tom thanked me. His wife asked about the honey. I told her the hives were 3 years old and the South Meadow clover made it taste different every season. She seemed genuinely pleased by that. I walked back across the road, feeling something I had not felt in 4 months on that stretch of the property. Nothing. In the good sense. No weight, no calculation, no low-grade alertness that comes from knowing someone nearby is looking for a way to cause you harm. Just the road and the fields and the early spring light sitting flat across the pasture. May was doing homework at the kitchen table when I came in. "How are they?" she said without looking up. "Seem all right," I said. "Better than her," she said. "May," I said. She looked up. "Most people are," I said. "You do not need to keep score." She made a face that meant she heard me and was reserving judgment. Fair enough. I hung my jacket on the hook by the door and looked out the window at the north entrance. 16 feet wide. Re-gravelled. Cedar posts still standing exactly where my father set them. Spring came the way it always does out here, not all at once, but in pieces. A warm week followed by a cold snap. The creek running higher than usual from the snowmelt up north. The cattle moving differently in the pasture, slower in the morning, more restless by afternoon. May finding a nest of field mice behind the hay bales and insisting we relocate them before I moved the stack. We relocated them. Life on a farm does not pause for the things that happen to you. It did not pause when my father died. It did not pause when my wife left. It did not pause when 2 men poured concrete across my entrance at 6 in the morning, while I stood there in wet socks trying to understand what was happening. You keep doing the work because the work does not care about your circumstances. The cattle need water regardless. The fence line needs checking regardless. May needs her lunch packed and her shoe tied and someone to carry her to bed when she falls asleep at the kitchen table regardless. That consistency, the daily insistence of the work, is something I used to find exhausting. I find it differently now. Not comforting exactly, more like stabilizing. When everything else is uncertain, the work is certain. The work is always there, and it always needs doing, and that turns out to be a form of solid ground. I thought about what this whole thing had cost me beyond the financial. 7 weeks of rerouted deliveries, dozens of hours researching, filing, driving to county offices, reading documents in archive rooms and parking lots. $150 for the initial consultation that turned out to be the most valuable money I spent. The low-grade stress of knowing a process was in motion that I could not fully control. That depended on other people doing their jobs correctly and on paperwork moving at the speed of county bureaucracy. And before all of that, 4 years of small incursions I had absorbed quietly because I was tired and busy and did not have energy for conflict. The dog and the fence complaint and the surveyor's visits and the hours I had spent building a buffer fence I should never have needed to build. I do not regret absorbing the early things. I was managing what I could manage at the time. You make the decisions available to you with the resources you have. What I learned, and I mean learned in the way that stays with you, not just the way that registers, is that absorbing something quietly is not the same as resolving it. It just postpones it. And sometimes what you are postponing is growing while you are not looking. Diane Creel did not become the problem she became overnight. She became it slowly, in increments, each one small enough to seem manageable, until the increments added up to concrete across my entrance and a work order that bypassed standard review and a neighbor standing at her property line smiling at what she had done. I should have drawn a line earlier. Not aggressively, not loudly, just clearly. The way my father drew lines, quietly, with documentation, in ways that were difficult to misunderstand. I know that now. There is a photograph on the wall above my desk. My grandfather is standing at the north entrance to this property. The cedar posts are not there yet, that came later, with my father. In the photograph it is just a gap in the tree line where the road meets the county road, and my grandfather is standing in that gap with one hand on a fence post and looking directly at the camera. He is not smiling. He is not performing anything. He is just standing on his land looking at whoever is holding the camera with the particular expression of a man who has recently acquired something he spent a long time working toward and is not yet fully convinced it is real. He bought this land in 1962. The cattle route that runs along the north boundary had been there since 1938. He would have known about it. He would have understood what it meant to have a recorded right-of-way running along the edge of land you owned outright. Another layer of protection. Another thing that was harder to take than it appeared. He kept every document in a fireproof box. My father set those cedar posts in the ground the year I was born. I re-gravelled the entrance to 16 feet the year a neighbor tried to bury it. 3 generations of the same instinct. Keep what is yours. Document everything. Do not make noise unless the noise serves a purpose. And when someone decides you are the kind of person things can be done to prove them wrong quietly, completely, and in ways they will not be able to undo. May asked me once, a few weeks after everything was resolved, whether I was glad the neighbor was gone. I thought about it honestly before I answered. I am glad the situation is resolved, I said. I do not think much about her. But she was mean to us, May said. She was, I said. And that is over now. May looked at me with the expression she gets when she thinks I am being deliberately simple about something complicated. Maybe I was. But the honest answer was that I did not carry Diane Creel with me. She had made her decisions, and I had made mine, and the land was intact, and the entrance was open, and the cattle route that my grandfather's neighbors had used to move livestock in 1938 was back on the county register as active. That was enough. Some mornings I drive out the north entrance on my way to the county road, and I feel those extra 4 feet of gravel on either side of the truck, and I think about my father setting those posts and my grandfather standing in the gap in the tree line looking at the camera. I think about May asking if we won. I kept what was ours. That is what winning looks like. That is all it ever needed to look like.